And that brings us to the fourth week of this series. How many of you this past week, either out loud maybe, or just to yourself, you said one of the following things? I just don't have enough time in the day to get everything done that I need to get done. Anybody out loud or to yourself? Or maybe you said, I hear this one a lot. I actually said this. I think it was on Friday. I'm just tired. I'm just tired. I have so much going on. I'm just tired. How many of you said this past week, I'm busy? That's like the number one response. Hey, how are you doing? Well, you know me. I'm busy. Got a lot going on. It's like our default response. I'm just busy. I'm tired. Maybe you said something like this, work is just killing me right now. I can't keep up. Or school is killing me. I can't keep up. Internally, you may have even thought, I'm worried, I'm anxious, I can't stay on top of all of this stuff that's going on. I just feel overwhelmed. And unfortunately, due to the way our society is structured, we think that that's how we have to live. Based on the way we structure our own lives, we think this is how I have to live. I have no choice but to live busy. I have no choice but to live tired. I have no choice but to live frustrated. This is just the way things are. But what if there was a different way to live? What if there was an alternative reality that we could live in that has been made possible for us through Jesus? You see, this practice of Sabbath that we're about to talk about, this is going to sound a little crazy at first. Sabbath is a 24-hour period of time where you disconnect from work, where you disconnect from the hustle and bustle of life, and you say, I or my family or a group of friends, we are going to spend 24 hours in a community together becoming like Jesus and disconnecting. And you might be thinking, 24 hours, okay, I can't do that right now. Scott, you don't know what I have going on in my life, and I get it. I'll be honest with you. When you're like going through seminary or Bible school, one of the things they tell you is, hey, don't preach on something unless you have implemented it in your life as well. Like practice what you preach, that kind of thing. I must confess, I have not yet implemented a 24-hour Sabbath in my life or in our family's life. So we are going to learn and lean into this together, especially as we go into the group next month, as we continue to talk about this. But one of the things you'll hear from practicing the way over and over again is start where you are, not where you think you should be or not where you want to be. And so one of the things that I've started doing is I wake up every Saturday at 5 a.m. Some of you say, yeah, that's about right. Some of you say, that's way too early. I don't know what your schedule looks like, but I wake up every Saturday at 5 a.m. I spend some time in Scripture, I spend some time in prayer, and I don't look at my phone on Saturdays until 5 p.m. I've started doing this for a couple of months ago, and it's a way of slowly integrating Sabbath into my life. And as a family with Kim and Clark, we have recently started integrating a 6-hour Sabbath into our week where we just disconnect from everything. And so we are slowly working towards it'll then move to 12 and then hopefully to 24 at some point in time. But you say 24 hours, it is a lot. It sounds like a lot. But how exactly can we implement this, and why should we even bother implementing Sabbath in our lives? And that's what I would like to talk with you about this morning. Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Jesus says that rest is made available in him. And this is more than just, in my life, I'm just going to yell out to Jesus whenever I feel overwhelmed. Now, yes, Jesus does answer and respond to us whenever we feel overwhelmed and we call upon his name. But Jesus is inviting us to so much more in this passage. Jesus is inviting us to a different way of living, to find rest in him, not to find rest in scrolling on social media, which really never even provides rest anyway, if we're to be honest with ourselves, not to find rest in just, getting worried and moving, but to find rest in Jesus. Jesus is inviting us to a different way of living. And so my invitation for us this morning is that we would create space to rest with Jesus and to find rest in Jesus. For just a few moments, I'd like to provide for you a few observations about Sabbath that I believe are pretty convincing for us to consider why we should implement this practice in our lives. Even if you can't be with us at the course in June, I would like to invite you to think about how can I start to implement this not just in my life, but in our family's life as well. First observation is this: Sabbath is resistance. Sabbath is resistance to the ways of the world, to the ways of empire, to the way of society, to the way of saying, oh, this is just how things have to be. No, Sabbath is saying there's a different way of living. There's an alternative way that we can live in. There's an alternative option for us to be humans. We don't have to live under the American idea that I just have to be busy all the time and I always have to have something going on. No, Sabbath is resistance to that. We see Sabbath beginning as resistance as early on as the book of Exodus. Because in the book of Exodus, the Israelites were enslaved to Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and Pharaoh was overworking the Israelites. It was work, work, work. And then Moses comes along and starts confronting Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh says, you know what, Moses, I don't really like this, so I'm actually going to make the working conditions even worse for the Israelites. Check this out in Exodus chapter 5, verses 4 through 9. The king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you cause the people to refrain from their work? Return to your labor. Pharaoh was thinking, the people of the land are now many, and you are giving them rest from their labor? That same day, Pharaoh commanded the slave masters and foremen who were over the people, you must no longer give straw to the people for making bricks as before. Let them go and collect straw for themselves. But you must require of them the same quota of bricks that they were making before. Do not reduce it, for they are slackers. That is why they are crying, let us go sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the men, so they will keep at it and pay no attention to lying words. Pharaoh is saying, no, I'm not going to let these people go. In fact, just continue to work them harder and harder. Make conditions even worse for them. They have to make their own bricks, and this is the way of empire. This is the way of the world. Just keep working and never stop and never find any rest, never have a recharge. Just always keep going and going and going. And what's so interesting about the time that we are now in is that we are in a time when we have a bit of a choice. As those of us who live in the United States, we have a bit of a choice as to how we choose to conduct our lives. The Israelites didn't have a choice at the time. They were enslaved to Pharaoh. They were people who were oppressed with no rights. And so they didn't have a choice when they were under the rule of Pharaoh, but we continue to choose hurry. We continue to choose, I'm just going to consume my time with my phone. I'm just going to consume my mind with 1 million podcasts a day, even though I can't even remember what the last one was about. But I just have to keep going and going. Consume more content. Do more things. But Sabbath is a way of resistance to that way of life. Don't some of us, don't you want a way out? Do you want to not be hurried? Not always feel like you have 1 million things going on? Yes, we want to work hard and we want to be productive. Sabbath is not laziness, by the way. Because some people mistake Sabbath. Sabbath is not a day to just gorge yourself and do whatever you want and just, eat 1 million potato chips and binge Netflix all day. That's not what Sabbath is. Sabbath is a time of finding rest in Jesus after we've been engaged in hard work throughout the week. Check this out in Deuteronomy chapter 5. You are to work and do all your tasks in 6 days. This is God speaking to the nation of Israel. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. On that day you must not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male slave, your female slave, your ox, your donkey, any other animal, or the resident foreigner who lives with you, so that your male and female slaves, like yourself, may have rest. Recall that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there by strength and power. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So God is saying to Israel, you will have this day of rest to be with him, to be with God, but also to remind yourselves of what you have been set free from. Sabbath is resistance to empire. Sabbath is resistance to the ways of the world. Sabbath is another way of living to say, I'm not going to give in to that. I want to live differently. I want to be with God and hear from God and allow that to shape my life and my family and my friend group and beyond. In 1989, Dr. Marva Dawn wrote a book called Keeping the Sabbath Holy. And I found this observation from her to be captivating. Even 35 years later, it's almost more appropriate now than it was then. She said, one of the ugliest things about our culture is that we usually assess a person's worth on the basis of his or her productivity and accomplishments. The criterion for everything in our society has become efficiency. Why do we judge others on the same basis that always leaves us feeling empty? Let me read that again. One of the ugliest things about our culture is that we usually assess a person's worth on the basis of his or her productivity and accomplishments. The criterion for everything in our society has become efficiency. Why do we judge others on the same basis that always leaves us feeling empty? The practice of Sabbath is resistance to a way of life that leaves us feeling empty, that we always have to compete with others, that we always have to keep up. No, it's a different way of living. Second observation, the purpose of Sabbath is to be with Jesus. The purpose of Sabbath is to be with Jesus. I want to make this very clear because sometimes we start implementing practices into our lives, and they very quickly become a form of either self-righteousness or a form of, as I mentioned earlier, maybe even laziness. But the purpose of Sabbath is not so that we can feel better about ourselves because we're doing something that other people aren't doing. No, we invite others into Sabbath. Sabbath is not so that we can just do whatever we want whenever we want. We don't look to practice Sabbath just because our favorite fast food place, Chick-fil-A, practices Sabbath. That's not why we do it. We seek to practice Sabbath to rest with Jesus and be with Jesus. That's the purpose of Sabbath. In fact, in the Christian world, there are basically two primary views. Some Christians believe that Christians are required to practice Sabbath. Some believe that it's not a requirement. I actually do fall in the latter category. I would say, hey, this is not necessarily required, but I think it's extremely wise. As I began implementing it slowly into my life, I've felt the benefits of letting go and resting with Jesus. As I've talked to friends of mine, some of you know them, like Neil and Lindsay Friedman, who do now practice a 24-hour Sabbath, I've seen the transformation of what God is doing in their lives, and I'm like, oh, I want to be like them. I want that in my life as well. The purpose of Sabbath is to rest with Jesus. So you're saying, okay, Scott, but it's not required, so, maybe I could just work around it. I look at it this way. I'm not a bowler. I don't ever go bowling. But every once in a while I do because somebody invites me. But when I bowl, if I at all want to hit at least one pin, I have them put up like the gutter guards that they put for children because I just can't do it. I'm not good at it. You don't need the gutter guards or whatever they're called to go bowling, but they can be very helpful for you accomplishing a particular accomplishment that you want, that you like. I'd like to hit some pins. Sabbath, you can rest in Jesus and find Jesus in that sense without practicing Sabbath, but it just makes things a lot more complicated. It makes it a lot more difficult to accomplish that goal of finding rest in Jesus. Because how many of us know that very quickly the days start to get away from us, they just start to move on by, and I get filled up with that and that. But if we build in our schedules this time to rest with Jesus and be with Jesus, it begins to shape our lives. And the purpose of Sabbath is to rest with Jesus, not just to put a random religious obligation into our lives. It's to rest with Jesus because Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. So it is in Sabbath that we have a foreshadowing, a signpost to the eternal rest that we will have with Jesus. Check this out in Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. Jesus was going through the grain fields on a Sabbath, and his disciples picked some heads of wheat, rubbed them in their hands, and ate them. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is against the law on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? How he entered the house of God, took and ate the sacred bread, which is not lawful for any to eat but the priests alone, and gave it to his companions? Then he said to them," this is so important, The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is over the Sabbath. So therefore, the Sabbath is a day where we seek to find rest in Jesus and be with Jesus. I love this translation of Luke 6:5. It says, the Son of Man is no slave to the Sabbath. He's in charge. So when we implement these practices into our lives, it's with the intention that Jesus is over them and we are there to connect with our King and become like him. And then it is from the Sabbath where we can connect with Jesus and hear from Jesus, and in that, Jesus starts to produce in our lives. He starts to shape our lives and shift our lives into becoming more and more like him. Check this out in Luke chapter 6, verses 6 through 11. On another Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and was teaching. Now a man was there whose right hand was withered. The experts in the law and the Pharisees watched Jesus closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they could find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, "Get up and stand here." So he rose and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save a life or destroy it?" After looking around at them all, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." The man did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with mindless rage and began debating with one another what they would do to Jesus. Now, there's a deeper meaning to this particular text, but I believe that an application that we can draw from it is this, is that on the Sabbath, Jesus healed this man's hand. So in those moments when we choose to practice Sabbath and we rest with Jesus, it is for the purposes of Jesus producing something good in our lives. It is for the purposes of us meeting with Jesus and him bringing healing to our lives. Just as we see in this passage, the religious leaders were confused. You're not supposed to do anything. And Jesus is like, no, this day that I am now over, that I am king of, if you practice this, I will meet you there. And it is in that space that he begins to do healing in our lives. He begins to transform our minds, conform us to his image, and bring about his good work. Because as the Apostle Paul said, he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. How often are we spending time listening for the one who desires to bring healing in our lives, who desires to bring wholeness in life? Last observation, Sabbath is reorientation. It's a complete reorientation of our lives and our priorities. So Sabbath is a day when you implement it. It's a time, a day that you look forward to, but it's also a time that shapes your week so that you look ahead with a Jesus-centered perspective. It completely reorients our life. It reorients what we're looking forward to throughout the week, and then it reorients how we look towards the week ahead. It reorients our perspective around Jesus and centers that in finding rest in him. So going back to where we started, Jesus said this, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I wonder how many people here this morning would say, "Yeah, I've been weary," even just yesterday, or even just this past week. I wonder how many of us here today would say, "I've been carrying some burdens, some things that are just heavy." My suggestion to us is that we would seek to find this rest in Jesus, where he brings healing and wholeness and life. The Apostle Paul wrote this to the church at Galatia. He said, "My children, I am again undergoing birth pains until Christ is formed in you." That was Paul's goal and desire for his church, that Christ would be formed in them. And that's been at the essence of this entire series, that we would create space in our lives for Jesus to be formed in us, for us to become more like him. And it's through practicing the way and through implementing these different spiritual practices and disciplines that we will have opportunities to hear from Jesus and be formed into the likeness of Jesus. That living as a new creation in Christ is not just something we say out loud. It's not just something that we do when it's convenient. No, becoming a new creation in Christ is creating space to become like Christ and to be representatives of King Jesus. So my invitation for each of us is that we would create space to rest with Jesus, or to find rest with Jesus. So I know some of you might be thinking about, okay, this sounds great. I would love to find rest in Jesus. I'd love to become more like Jesus. When I read the Gospels, they really excite me, and I'd love to be like him. And this idea of practicing Sabbath, it sounds great, but you know what? I just don't have time for it right now. There's so much going on, and I just don't know if I can do it. And I also don't know I'd ever hear a message that says the word Sabbath so many times. He just keeps saying the same thing over and over again. I just don't know. There's just so much going on. You know what? I'm just going to go home, and maybe I'll think about it. Maybe I won't think about it. Or, you know, it was a good day at church. I'll come back next week for the James series, but, you know, I don't know how about this whole thing. I don't even know how to start. I don't even know what to do. I don't know if you're actually thinking those things, but some of you might be thinking some of those things. So what would be some next steps? How can you maybe pray about having this idea or principle of Sabbath in your life to find rest with Jesus? Well, first step would be this: just simply pray about it. Spend some time in prayer. Ask the Holy Spirit to reveal to you where you may have some wasted time in your life, where you maybe have your priorities, they've kind of been out of whack. And allow the Spirit of God to speak to you about that. Secondly, if you are married, talk this over with your spouse. Say, hey, how can we change our schedules up a little bit so that we can maybe bring this practice into our lives? If you are single, invite others to do this with you, or invite yourself to crash somebody else's Sabbath. You don't always have to do this alone. Sometimes we try to implement spiritual practices all on our own, and then there's not as much accountability involved, and it becomes difficult. But invite others into this with you. Sabbath can be celebratory. It doesn't have to just be, hey, all day long, I'm just sitting and praying and not talking to anybody. No, it can be a celebratory, restful experience where we seek to find rest in Jesus. So invite others into this with you. Community is so important in implementing the spiritual practices, and not to try to do this all alone. Third, start small. Start small. You think, I don't know if I could do 24 hours right now. Start with 3 hours. Start with 6 hours. Start with 12 hours. Wherever you can start. Start where you're at, not where you think you should be or want to be. But then also implement accountability in your life so that somebody can say, hey, you know what? You've been doing 6 hours for like a year now. Can we add a little more? Can we make some more space? Can we create some more space? Start small. Pray about it. Bring others in. And then if you're available, join us for the 4-week course in June, as we will be learning together. I will be learning alongside you how we can implement this practice in our lives so that we can better find rest in Jesus and hear from him and become like him. If you would please bow your head.